Ethically Speaking is a podcast of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business.
Hello, and welcome to episode 17 of Ethically Speaking, a podcast presented by the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business at the University of Denver. I'm Dan Sweeney, the director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics, and we just finished a roundtable discussion with 20 to 25 practicing executives and independent directors and professional service providers on the topic of, does corporate, political, or social activism actually pay off? 30 years ago, it was considered taboo for corporations to take a political or social stand on issues. However, employees and consumers today are among the most vocal advocates for change, forcing corporations to take notice. Business leaders like Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, and Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks, have been very proactive with their support for corporate social activism, and other corporations are following suit. What happens when the company takes an unpopular political stand? How do these political and social decisions affect the corporation's financial success? Is it possible for a corporation to remain neutral on such issues? Fortunately, we have an expert on these issues to help us with these questions. He also led the discussion at the roundtable earlier today. Paul Seaborn is an assistant professor in the Department of Management at the Daniels College of Business. Prior to joining Daniels in 2011, Professor Seaborn completed his doctoral studies in strategic management at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. He previously worked as a consultant for Mercer Management Consulting and for IBM Global Services. His research interests include corporate political activity, industry regulation and self-regulation, and political economy. Paul, that was quite an interesting and engaging conversation we just had. So I've got to ask you, does corporate political and or social activism actually pay off for these organizations?
No, that's a great question, Dan. I think one thing that we all agreed on in the room was that asking this question 10 or 20 years ago, there wouldn't really be much to talk about. The phenomenon of having corporations and CEOs so visible and so looked to for voices on these social issues just didn't exist. Here we are today where that expectation is there. Whether it pays off or not, I think the consensus was it depends. We have great examples where firms have used their leadership on social issues, whether directly related to their business or not, to gain credibility. We had folks in the room talk about Patagonia, about Starbucks, firms, a lot of these consumer firms where their social activism creates a bond and an affinity from consumers, from employees, from customers. And in those cases, when it's handled well, you get that payoff. We also had plenty of discussion and examples where it can backfire, right? There's a sensitivity to these issues where not every member of the public will always agree with the corporation, yet they're trying to take a single position, and so that's the risk. In my portion of the presentation, I showed some survey results asking the general public whether they want to hear from CEOs and why they think CEOs and corporations speak up. And those survey results, I think, were a reminder of the risk. Not all the public wants to hear from the CEO in the first place. We've had backlashes against firms like Hobby Lobby, who advocate a very morally thoughtful position on providing birth control access to their employees through insurance. They are very clear and open about that position, and taking it to court. And you get a mixed, or in some cases, net negative reaction from customers if their beliefs don't align with the company. And the second part of that survey was on how this activity is perceived. A lot of skepticism in the public as to the motive. Is this self-interest by the CEO individually or the corporation? And as long as the public is skeptical, I think that raises the chance that there could be a backlash, that you're being opportunistic, or you've entered a discussion that corporations should stay out of. And so unfortunately, I think the answer is it depends, and that's why CEOs and corporations have a tough job, and why CEOs get paid a lot of money. They're in that hot seat, and they're the ones who are really the face of these decisions and will reap the benefits or the costs.
That's kind of how our conversation with the group ended, right? It all depends.
Yeah.
Paul, it may or may not pay off. It may or may not actually harm the corporation in some way. What are the benefits, and then on the other hand, what are the costs? How does the company trade those off?
So I think one of the aspects that makes this topic so fascinating and also so challenging is that there are multiple potential benefits, and a lot of those same areas could become costs, right? So the first one that most people gravitate to is some sort of direct financial benefit, right? If a CEO speaks out, if the company takes a stand, does that lead to increased willingness to purchase from that company, or maybe willingness to pay more for that company's products? And that you can tie directly to the bottom line. Similarly for investors, maybe they're willing to put their funds into your company, or they don't take it out because they see that alignment. And thirdly, one step removed, if you can attract and retain employees that are going to be valuable, that are going to generate financial returns because of your activism, because that's a magnet for the key people you need, those are all pretty direct financial benefits. The second category that we see firms pursuing is a more broad reputational benefit, right? This warm glow of the firm having taken a stand. And someday down the road, maybe that does lead to the purchase or the employment decision. But in the short term, it can still elevate them relative to other companies in their community, with politicians. A lot of firms want to be viewed as responsible and engaged, and not just staying on the sidelines. That's external, but you can also see that working on the internal side, where as an employee, I see my CEO or I see the company speak out. That gives me some sort of boost in morale. I feel like my job means more, and we may not be able to point to the financial bottom line impact of that in the moment, but there's a sense that we can get some energy and some engagement from our employees. And then if you think of the political realm, companies have lots of other tools for influencing the regulation and political environment. They can lobby, in the way that they've done for a long time. They can make campaign contributions and specifically give money. But this activism role is another lever that they have with politicians as well. It shows that they're influential in the public realm. It communicates their desired preferences very vocally. We're coming out in a press release or on social media and stating what we think on this particular proposed law, whether it's Obamacare or immigration, et cetera. And so this is giving them another avenue to potentially get political benefit if those things align. But I think as you think about each of those levers I've just mentioned, you can imagine each one going the other direction and backfiring in a negative way, right? We could scare away customers, employees, investors. We could hurt our reputation in the marketplace. We could alienate or cross politicians who don't take kindly to that. And so, again, that's the nuance here is navigating and trying to get the benefits above the positives. And then there's also an overarching question of whether firms should be so calculative on doing this, right? Some of our most visible CEOs, Howard Schultz at Starbucks, or Cook at Apple, would say there's also a moral responsibility here. You can put everything I've just talked about aside on certain issues. As visible representatives of our company with the platform, we have a moral obligation to speak on some issues, regardless of how the calculus looks to fall out. And in some ways, we can actually change the calculus by us speaking out. We could actually convert people to our side and maybe make it more appealing, even though on the moment we speak, we're going against the tide. And so there's a lot going on in that calculation at the corporate level. Maybe the public doesn't see it all, but this is a fraught area, and I think our guests today really were struck at the end by this minefield that CEOs are being pulled into more and more. There's an expectation, but now you have to deliver on that expectation.
One of the illustrations you used during our conversation was Chick-fil-A. And this is a privately owned, closed corporation, family-controlled, and the family is a very religious family. And they opened a Chick-fil-A store in the new Atlanta Falcons stadium, NFL stadium, and they refused to open it on Sunday because Sunday is the day of the Lord. Now, that's a pretty strong position to take, closing their store on the only day that the venue's open.
Yeah, I think that's a great example where a purely bottom line calculation might lead you another way, right? There is going to be one Monday night game this year, so they'll get one opportunity to demonstrate their new store. But for those other Sundays, customers will walk by and see it. Maybe indirectly they respect that adherence to their policy. Maybe the other days of the week they feel that much more comfortable, frequenting Chick-fil-A. There may be some indirect benefit, but there's no argument that to allow 80,000 people to walk by your closed store every Sunday of the season is not hitting the bottom line. And so I think that's a great example of the dilemma that these corporations enter into, but also maybe the way that they can really stand out. This is a unique position. We talked about Hobby Lobby as another example. These are positions that really are now associated with these companies. When I say Hobby Lobby to my students, or when I talk about Chick-fil-A, they immediately gravitate to those aspects, which really have nothing to do with their day-to-day business. Assuming that companies are always just going to do the bottom line calculation, I think is naive. But these are great examples to think about how far the decision making can go. And Starbucks had their own example with this around race relations. Right? It's not obvious to most of us as customers of a coffee shop that race relations ties into our day-to-day relations with the company. But when I have a barista writing a phrase on my coffee cup around race relations and prompting a discussion, they're really going beyond what you would normally expect. I think that's probably a great example where the reaction was skeptical. People didn't see the link or the need, and it didn't last very long, which I think is a test of how it was working. But on the other hand, Starbucks is still around. We talk about them as a leader in this area. Howard Schultz takes pride in pushing the envelope, I think, on these social issues. And so I'm not sure we can even point at that as an absolute failure, because Starbucks still has that prominent position, and we still listen to their voice on a variety of issues.
Yeah. Well, it's a tough decision for these companies to make. Paul, this appears to be sort of a very contemporary, sort of a modern phenomenon that we're dealing with, this issue of corporate activism. I've been in business for quite a long time, and I don't remember it being anywhere near this frequent and intense in the early days of my career. So why is it happening now?
So that's a great question, Dan. I think we could all think back to specific examples in previous decades when a corporation took a stand on an issue, but what we've really seen is now there's an expectation that on multiple issues, on a frequent basis, companies and CEOs will take a stand, and absolutely that is a big change for everyone involved. We can point out a number of different factors, and we had a rich discussion with lots of great examples from our guests on each of these. There's been an increase in the transparency of what CEOs and corporations do, and you can tie that to social media, the idea that the CEO has in his or her pocket the ability to immediately communicate to hundreds, if not thousands or millions of constituents, and at the same time that those hundreds or millions of constituents can send messages and can and highlight activities of the firm. Right, that level of scrutiny and in real time never existed before. But there's even more going on besides that. Lots of third parties have evolved to grade and report on corporate policies. There's lots of additional reporting taking place through our normal SEC channels, through voluntary initiatives. So a whole raft of ways in which there's just a lot more transparency. We actually know what these companies are thinking and what they're doing, and we didn't really have that visibility in the past. The second key factor, which a number of our guests spoke to, was around a generational shift, that the millennial generation, that group that was born in the late 80s, early 90s, and maybe even more so Generation Z or Z, depending on your preference, coming after, that they, as customers, as potential employees, over time as investors, they have an expectation that they want to affiliate themselves with companies who have values that they support or respect, and that's a change as well. And one of our guests was kind of viewing this as a luxury of time and choice. Right, there was a time probably when folks coming out of school looking for a job, or customers going to the store, they're worried about just basic needs. I need a job. I need to buy a low-cost product. I'm not going to get too concerned about whether the loaf of bread on the shelf comes from a company that has a certain social position. Perhaps we're in a world where customers and employees have that luxury to think about more. Plus, the transparency gives them the information to use that. So that's a big factor, and I think it's probably only going to continue as new generations come along that take this for granted, that know CEO's voice, to be relevant in the discussion.
I think there's another cause there, and we're here at the Daniels College of Business, endowed by Bill Daniels, and with that endowment, he gave the school a challenge, a charge, a mission to teach responsible business, to teach ethical business, to teach integrity, and so on. There's a lot of other schools around the country that did the same thing, and my suspicion is that message actually stuck with a lot of people, and now we're realizing the results of that.
Yeah, I think my students always respond positively to being shown the complications and the messiness of these ethical dilemmas. And I think, in previous generations, we maybe did a disservice for glossing over some of these things. And so, yeah, there seems to be both a supply of it from business schools and other external organizations, if you think of Aspen Institute and others that are raising these issues, but also I think a demand in our generations that are coming into the classroom and going into the workforce. It's part of what they've grown up with and they expect. A couple other issues I would say that have really led to this change. One would be of celebrity culture, specifically for CEOs, the idea that a Mark Zuckerberg or Howard Schultz or Tim Cook at Apple, people feel like they know them. They want to know, what they're up to personally and professionally. They can follow them, through all these various channels. There's that greater familiarity with CEOs, more almost in some cases eclipsing the company that they represent or having at least equivalent visibility. And I think we see that in other areas of society, professional sports and reality TV and such. And then the final factor I think that's pushing more and more activism is our political system in the U.S. We have a fair bit of gridlock in terms of addressing some issues that are recognized as being a concern. And there's certainly a very partisan environment. If you think of what it takes to get the nomination in a particular party's runoff, right? It often requires going to the extreme as opposed to moving to the middle, which is kind of been the traditional thought. And so the more that government is divided, I think a couple of impacts. One, consumers and others are looking to corporations to find some middle ground, maybe because they appeal to a broad cross-section that crosses party lines. And so suddenly the corporation is actually defining a more moderate position maybe than the parties. But then on the other hand, it raises a real minefield because you can alienate constituents very easily if you don't align with their views. And some issues where there's really not consensus, corporations are really being pulled between extreme views and not able to kind of navigate down the middle. So when you put together generational changes, social media, celebrity culture, and the political system, you can see why we're in a whole different landscape. And directors and board members, CEOs are being faced with a whole new set of skills and responsibilities and risks, and it's certainly a whole new world.
Well, it sounds to me like it's an issue whose time has come. Paul, I want to get into the issue of how a company goes about the process of identifying an issue they want to get behind, especially when the chief spokesman for that issue is the CEO. So do these issues just kind of sprout from the CEO's brow all by themselves? Are they the result of some kind of polling of the organization to see what the mood of the organization is? Is it a result of intense, deep conversations among the board of directors? At the end of the day, what happens if some employees don't agree with that position, if some directors don't agree with that position, or what if the CEO himself doesn't agree with the position?
You've really hit on where the evolution of this issue still has a long way to go. Right? We're in the early years of having this as such a prominent phenomenon, and I don't know that we could really point to a best practice or a universal standard. So I think we can think of examples where a CEO is really out in front on a particular issue and then follow up to figure out how that matches or doesn't match with the folks in the organization. Howard Schultz, again, if we go back to Starbucks, my sense that he's pushed some of these issues with a personal commitment. Race relations would be one, I think. You could certainly think of ways in which race relations matters to the everyday employee at Starbucks. They're diverse in their own population. They interact with a diverse population. They work in a community that is affected by these issues. But on that particular one, I think there's a consensus that it was pushed by the CEO, and then there was a close enough fit with parts of the organization to make it viable. But there was that friction when it came time to me as a barista teeing off a conversation with someone who I generally stick to name and order, and maybe it was too soon, too far when that first came through. One of our participants today was interested in the measurement side, and I do think there actually is a fair bit going on in terms of polling and surveying both employees, the general public, investor groups, right? There's a lot more data being collected that allows for issues to bubble up. We can actually do an employee survey and figure out what are the social issues that our employees are most interested in. We can survey the public and also get a sense for our customers versus our competitors. I was at a conference a few years ago on corporate political activity and some of these issues. The head of government relations for ExxonMobil was there, and he talked about how ExxonMobil on a monthly basis has a public opinion panel that is asked questions around their overall perception of the ExxonMobil brand and specific initiatives that ExxonMobil is taking from month to month. He said they didn't do that to feel good about themselves because they didn't necessarily rise to the top of the charts, but any uptick or downtick on the overall perception or on particular actions was very informative to their overall policy-making process. And I would assume they probably had similar readouts from the employee side. And so, yeah, you've got the opportunity for issues to come from the top down or from the bottom up, and it really makes for a complicated environment. Part of what I took away from our discussion today was the board really playing a key role in navigating those two sets of issue paths. You know, they want to have some visibility to what a CEO is going to do and not be reading it, on their Twitter feed or on the front page at the same time as the rest of the world. So, wanting to stay informed and maybe defining formally the degree of latitude they want to give the face of the company to speak freely and what degree they want to rein that in or have approvals. And then similarly, wanting to make sure that employee voices are being heard and translated into the C-suite. The board is at a great vantage point to help define those processes as well, make sure that maybe a CEO isn't overlooking other constituents and maybe speaking only from his or her personal opinion. So there's no easy answer today. I think we'll spend a lot of time as academics and practitioners trying to define these paths, developing policies, looking at best practices to figure out how these issues go from that first flashpoint to something that a corporation really is willing to hang their hat on and deal with the consequences.
One of the examples that was brought up during that conversation had to do with the CEO of Merck, who was on one of the president's business advisory tables. And I don't know what teed this off, but something the president did caused him to resign from that committee. And the day after that happened, 4 or 5 others resigned from the committee as well. But in the case of Merck, some New York Times reporter found this out, that the day after he announced his resignation from that presidential commission, the board had an informal email and voicemail and telephone meeting discussing whether he should have done that and what role the board should have in it. And it was clear there that they didn't have a protocol. They had to make it up as they go along. And I think one of the big lessons that a lot of the people in this discussion, many of whom were independent directors, took away was we need on our board to have an established protocol so we'll know what to do if and when something happens.
Yeah, so the scope of crisis management in corporate America has just broadened. I think we had an understanding that we need to be aware of issues specific to our company, right? Is there a E. coli outbreak in the restaurant? Is there an environmental issue on the front lines? And that's a 24/7 job in itself because you never know when those issues are going to rise. The example you bring up around the Merck CEO stepping down from a presidential council, it wasn't triggered by a Merck-specific incident in any way. It was triggered, I believe, by the Charlottesville protests and then the response of government to that. And so, first of all, you have to have a wider net of what you're following because you may be looked at as a corporation to respond to something that's not directly related to you, maybe not even indirectly related to you, but it's a issue in the public realm, and there's expectation to respond. Secondly, as you bring up, then the question is, how do we respond? Do we have a protocol for a Sunday evening, Monday morning rapid response? Perhaps our Twitter followers are waiting for us to hit submit on a message, and what 140 characters are we going to put out, or what substantive action around our products and services, our participation, are we going to announce? And these are tight timelines. Merck was the leader in that situation, and then other firms followed. And I think we'll study that in great detail. I think a lot of lessons can be learned, but it's really just the new normal, in that you have to be ready to have a plan. Staying neutral and not being involved at all in political debate is now going to be viewed as an anomaly by these millennials and the generations that are coming. And so now that we're in that world, we have no choice but just to tool up and be ready. And so it's one of the comments today in our session was that this may change the qualifications and the selection of CEOs. We may be asking them to take on a new role in a publicly visible way, in a very broadly political way that traditional CEOs that were so successful in previous generations, maybe in a more servant leadership, kind of behind the scenes, less visible approach may struggle with. And so that's a key thought for any organization in terms of what leaders will be able to handle this scrutiny and navigate all these decisions.
Well, I have a pretty strong opinion that there's probably 2 or 3 boards here in Denver that are going to have a conversation led by one of the participants in this discussion we had, and that's exactly the kind of impact that we're looking for as the Institute for Enterprise Ethics. So thank you very much, Paul, for leading a great discussion for us.
No, it's my pleasure, Dan, and I'll take a lot of this discussion back to the classroom, and I think my students will be really have their eyes open to what's going on, not just in the headlines, which I think they all see maybe even more than we do on social media and elsewhere, but in the boardrooms and with the management folks that we had in our discussion today. And it's a great combination to have here at Daniels.
Ethically Speaking is a podcast of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business. College of Business. College of Business. College of Business.